Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today, I am so pleased to be sitting down to talk to Dana Rubin. For many years, Dana was a speechwriter, and she is still a long-standing judge for the annual Cicero Speechwriting Awards. She's also the founder of a company called Speaking Well Female, which advocates for women's speech and voice. She works with companies to help them develop their female talent and give women the mindset and the skill set to be known as authorities in their field. And finally, she has created the Speaking Well Female Speech Bank, which is a collection of speeches by women from across time and around the world. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, really. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I'm actually pretty excited about speaking to you because I think that having a speech bank of female speeches is probably pretty unique around the world. But before we jump into that, could you just give us a little bit of your background, where you live, what your training is, just a little bit of flavor of who you are?
Yeah, certainly. I grew up in Texas. I'm a Texas native, but I've lived in a lot of different places, including in London, in the UK for 6 years. And then I came to New York. So I've been in New York for quite a while. Now I think of myself as a New Yorker. As you mentioned, I was a speechwriter, but before that, I was a journalist. I worked as a magazine journalist, as a newspaper journalist. I also did some television news producing. So I was really immersed in the world of journalism before I made the transition to the world of speech writing, speech craft. And that led directly into the work that I now do, which is related to speech, focused on speech, but specifically women's speech.
Mm-hmm. And then that presumably led into the speech bank.
Absolutely. It was a straight shot from thinking about women speaking in the workplace to the realization that we needed to revise the way we think about the history of speech to include women, women's voices, women's speeches, women's testimony, women's expertise in the world of ideas, the public space, the marketplace of ideas.
And how did that realization, was there a particular moment when that realization came?
There were a series of things that happened that woke me up. In terms of women, the focus on women, I started noticing that there were so many men's points of view in the public sphere and not as many women's. I think it was maybe even 6 or 7 years ago or so, there was quite a bit of attention paid to the World Economic Forum in Davos. They meet every year in late January. And suddenly we're woken up. There was a realization that there were so few women. I think there's membership that accords them speaking platforms and so few women there. And there was news headlines, news articles about the fact that they had worked, focused on women, and the number of women represented was up to something like 17%. And I read that and said, holy moly, 17% is an accomplishment. We're celebrating that. You know, not to be too simplistic about this, but it really did dawn on me that something like the World Economic Forum, you can scoff at it, but this is where the heads of banks and financial institutions, the heads of every Fortune 500 company, all the major foundations, they get together, they kick around ideas, and they decide, what are we going to focus on? What are our values? What are the challenges that face humanity that we're going to focus on in the year to come? And when women aren't there, or when women are there, their voices and their expertise and their ideas are 17% of the conversation, that's a big gap. That is a huge gap. And that was just one thing that happened that really woke me up to the realization that we need to make a concerted effort to support women, support organizations, and support women to put their ideas into the world. The world needs women's expertise. It needs women's creativity. It needs women's point of view.
So just, I'd like, in a moment, I'd like to ask you more about what do you think is different in terms of a woman's point of view and a man's point of view. But before we do that, just tell me a little bit more about the project. When did you start? How far have you got?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the project. You mean the speech bank?
The speech bank.
The speech bank was really an outgrowth of that. I made the shift to focusing on women and women's speech and women's intellectual expertise. But then I made the shift into the speech bank when I realized that the history of speech, such as we know it, the history of oratory, the history of voice has been represented as a overwhelmingly male endeavor. And one day I went to my bookshelf. I literally went over to my bookshelf and I pulled out Lend Me Your Ears. It's a classic collection of speeches edited by William Safire, who was very well known in the States, especially. He had kind of celebrity status. He was a journalist for many years for the New York Times, and then he was a speechwriter for President Nixon way back before that. But he became, in his later years, a word expert, a word maven. He used to talk about the origins of word. He had a column in the New York Times for many years, so he had a big following. And he published this collection of speeches. And I pulled it off the shelf and I was astonished. I was shocked to count up all the speeches and discover there were something like 225 speeches by men and I think 20 speeches by women.
Gosh.
And I looked at that and I thought, that can't be right. That just can't be right. That in the sweep of history, I think it's a collection of women's speeches. I'm not sure if a speech of American. I'm not quite sure if it's American or global. I'm pretty sure it's American. There can't be right that there were only 20 women's speeches that mattered. Now, of course, there's always in these then it launched me into a concerted effort to look at these speech anthologies. And there's always a handful that make cut. It's Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an Eleanor Roosevelt, a Shirley Chisholm. Maybe if we're talking about the global stage, there's a Mother Teresa or a Indira Gandhi or a Malala. I mean, like I said, there's maybe 20 women's speeches. Elizabeth I in England to her troops at Tilbury or something like that. But there's always the same ones over and over and over and over. And I thought there have to be more. Why are we not focused on the fact that women have been speaking up their history? So I started doing the research. That was a real turn for me when I started to take a historical perspective and look at the past, not just because it's past, but because it informs the present and the future, of course. Who we count as role models, how we understand our history, who we look to for having contributed ideas, all this, it's a matrix of ideas that relate to this endeavor of rethinking the history of oratory.
And why do you think that women's speeches were being forgotten?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One of them, let's just be frank about this and get this out of the way. Women in general did not hold positions of institutional power and authority. They just didn't. They were denied education. Women weren't educated. They weren't allowed into the political sphere. I mean, even women were not even in the Roman Forum, which is in the ancient world where statesmen, rhetoricians gathered to talk about big ideas. Women weren't there. So women have been excluded from those spheres. So in general, they weren't talking about affairs of state, but not exclusively. I mean, there were women leaders. There were cultures and places where women were leaders. And of course, in England, we had there was royalty and Elizabeth I, and in other countries in Europe, there were women leaders. So that's one factor, that in general, there weren't women who had positions of power and authority. But in addition, there were prescriptions against women speaking in the ecclesiastical realm in the church. From the Middle Ages, women were denied access to the pulpit based on interpretations or readings of Matthew in the New Scripture, who said women should be silent in church. Many Christian churches denominations interpreted that to mean that women should not speak in church. And then, of course, during the 19th century, there was, especially in England, the United States, and other countries, there was a very divided notion of the spheres of men and women. And women's sphere was domestic and submissive and private and family-oriented. Women were seen as vessels for children, as controlling the home realm and the home sphere, while men were in the public sphere. So it was not acceptable for women to speak to a mixed audience. Now, a mixed audience was an audience with men and women. And that was called promiscuous audience. A promiscuous audience was one that had mixed genders. So in general, women weren't speaking to those audiences. Now, if they did speak, and there were many exceptions to it, who would come to hear them? Well, it wouldn't be the journalists. In general, journalists didn't come, didn't transcribe or write down what they say, didn't report it in the newspapers. So it became a vicious cycle. Women spoke to, a small audience, or an audience of just women, or an audience of iconoclasts, like maybe in one of the utopian communities where they went by different rules, or maybe in a abolitionist setting, some of the Quaker settings where women were allowed to speak. So in any case, women didn't speak to mainstream audiences, let's put it that way. Journalists didn't come. They didn't make transcriptions. They didn't put them in the newspapers. They weren't quoted. Therefore, they don't exist.
It just disappeared.
They disappeared, right? Like a lot of women's accomplishments. If they weren't sanctioned by the established gatekeepers of culture and ideas, then they didn't become part of the historical record.
And so that was the case in the US, in much of Europe. Was it the case as far as you've been able to tell, in the rest of the world? Are there societies where there were actually women who were making speeches, who were being listened to?
Well, first I need to say that I'm not a scholar. The learning that I have done has been on my own. I have tried to benefit from scholarship, so I have to put a big asterisk before what I say. But there were some African communities where women were leaders. There were indeed, and I have some of their speeches in my archive. I'm sure there are many more, but I have not dug them out. And it's quite a task to dig them out. Not only are they in different languages, but the resources are hard to find. A lot of them haven't been digitized. But I do have a few speeches by some communities in Africa that had women leaders. And there were some other pockets, some other places like Italy in the 18th century. There were a group of educated women who spoke, Laura Bassi and some other women who were highly educated. So it's not uniform. It's not uniform. Just the other day, I uncovered the testimony, or part of the testimony, of Artemisia Gentileschi.
What a fabulous name.
Artemisia Gentileschi she's acclaimed. She was one of the most accomplished Italian painters during the Baroque period. That would have been the 1700s. I think it was late 1700s. She was acclaimed in her day, and then, of course, fell into obscurity. But she was raped by a fellow painter. And she actually went to court. Her father sued that painter, and she went to court before a papal panel and testified about her sexual assault in the 1700s. And we have that testimony. That testimony exists, and I have a snippet of it that I put into my archive. And it's so interesting because today we have ongoing discussions about whether victims of sexual assault and violence should or can use their voices in public, whether they should be encouraged to do that or whether they should keep their voices silent. And it is an active debate right now. But here was an example, a role model of a woman who spoke about this and wasn't ashamed to speak about this from hundreds of years ago. These voices should be part of our record. We should acknowledge them, and they should be part of what we are aware of when we talk to people about women's voice and women's agency and women's role in society.
Do you know if she won? Do you have the result?
Gosh, I think I do know, but now I'm not sure, so I'm afraid to say. I believe she did. I think the answer is she won the case, but the offender paid no price for it, essentially.
Okay.
He was let off.
Okay. And what is the breadth of geographical breadth and historical breadth of the speech bank? How far back do you go? Which countries have you got speeches from?
Oh, I have speeches from all over the world. I'll give you some examples, but how far back does it go? I think the earliest one I have is from the ancient Rome. It's Hortensia, who was the daughter of a Roman consul protesting taxation, basically taxation without representation. There was a need to raise funds, public funds, to pay for ongoing wars in ancient Rome, and property owners were taxed and women were taxed. And Hortensia gave a speech, and she said, basically, we're not allowed to be in the public office. We're not allowed to vote for or against war. Why are we being taxed? And the interesting thing about that, well, there are many interesting things about it, but one is that was a key argument of the suffragists. Taxation without representation all over Europe and the United States. Why, if we contribute, some of us are property holders, we pay into our public coffers, but we don't have any say in the matter because we don't vote. So there is a historical thread going back centuries that women have been making the same argument through the centuries, which is powerful. It's powerful. It's like a continuum of ideas expressed by women.
And do you find that in the speeches that you're looking at, you see that continuum?
I do, but I have to draw it. I have to draw it myself. There's no one else who's been drawing that continuum. So what I did is I came up with categories. I think I have 33 or 36 different categories, and I put the speeches into different categories. Of course, many speeches, if not most, don't exist only in one category. They overlap. But this was just a matter of convenience to organize them. But what you see when you look at these categories, oh my gosh, women have been talking about the same subject. I mean, it's opened my eyes in so many different ways. I mean, I just recently made a category for violence and abuse. And of course, the testimony of Artemisia Gentileschi went in there. But when you look at that, it's heartbreaking and anger-making. I mean, it makes me furious to see that women have been talking about these same issues of being preyed upon, of being attacked, of being abused for so long. Same issues, similar language, sometimes the same language, centuries apart. So I want to go back and answer the question you asked me, where are the speeches from? Well, I am in the United States and I speak English. So the majority of the speeches are from English speakers, probably the United States and Britain. And of course, one of the periods in history when women stepped up to the public speaking platform in a very powerful way, what numerically was the suffrage period. Suffrage, agitation for suffrage preceded the American Civil War, 1840s, and went all the way till we won the vote in 1919. But in Britain, similar period. But so I would say the end of the 19th century, thousands and thousands and thousands of women in the United States and in Britain were speaking up for suffrage. Now, they were also speaking up in Belgium, in Switzerland, in France, and other countries. Oh, the first country to allow women to vote was New Zealand.
Yes, I knew that.
So all of the English-speaking world, I have the majority of speeches come from the English-speaking world because it was the suffrage period was a very active time for women's speech, but also because they're easier for me to find because the resources exist online. A lot of them have been digitized and I can find them. There were women all around the world speaking in other languages, and they're harder for me to find. My skills I can find some speeches in Spanish and French. My skills at finding speeches in German are lousy, but I have lots of speeches from not lots, but I have speeches from South America. I've been able to find speeches from women in Argentina and in Brazil. Of course, that's Portuguese, and in Chile, women who are speaking up for women's rights and women's safety and the family and religion. Mexico, lots of women speaking up in Mexico about religion, about the role of the church. Ermelina Galindo gave a very powerful speech, historic speech, about the role of the Catholic Church in women's rights and women's development. So it's really limited by the limits of my own expertise. And my vision, of course, would be to get some kind of funding so that I could hire or have a team of volunteers or maybe paid interns work to digging up these speeches. Because it's beyond the capacity of what one person can do alone.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned some of the themes that the women are talking about. So you mentioned that they're talking about violence against women. They're talking about representation without taxation without representation, and the role of the women in the church. What are some of the other themes that you see?
Okay, I'll tell you, it's going to be a long list, but of course, first of all, women speak about the family. They speak about family life. They speak about children and education. Women have been speaking out about education for a long time. Women were denied education, and there were reformers in the early 1900s, 1810s, speaking about the need to educate women. Women deserved an education. Then, of course, when we move into the mid-19th century and later 19th century, the reformers, the Victorian reformist movement, had women speaking about prison reform, about prostitution, and the laws that made it okay for men to get off scot-free if they patronized prostitution, but women to be thrown into prison, and about venereal disease, which was a terrible scourge, about the double standard. I mean, that was the sexual double standard is what they're talking about sanitation and medicine and healthcare. The Florence Nightingales and the Mary Seacoles spoke. They spoke, and the Dorothea Dix and many, many more spoke about the need for prison reform and to change our public institutions, our orphanages, our children's homes. Then, of course, there was public affairs. Women were speaking about war and peace. I mean, I have a category for war and peace. It is astonishing to look and see about how many women were speaking for peace. There were peace activists, very active peace movement before in the years around World War I, but even way before that, but for war too. There's a long history of women talking about the need to go into battle, to fight for liberties or fight for principles on every spectrum of the argument. That's an important point to make, that within each category, women took every point of view. There was no topic in history in which women had exactly the same point of view. Very often, their points of view conflicted because they were contributing in a healthy and diverse way to the public debate. So we had women who were for suffrage. We were women who were against suffrage. I have a reproductive issues section. There's many women speaking about the need for contraception and the need for abortion rights, availability of abortion, and there are equally many women speaking against that. And from my perspective, they are all welcome. They are all welcome. And of course, there's no way I could agree with all these women's points of view. That's an absurdity, but I put them all there because I want to demonstrate one point, which is that women have been speaking out for all these issues, using their voices to make change as they see it.
And how, if these speeches haven't been recorded by journalists and haven't been getting into newspapers, how do you find them?
Well, first of all, some have. And if they have, then I'm on them like a dog with a bone. I'm trying to track them down. But they're also in other places, not just journalists, not just newspapers. Some of them were turned into pamphlets, and the pamphlets were published. Some of them are in tracts, TRACT, tracts. Some were published in like the annals of organizations. Many hundreds did appear in newspapers, but they've fallen into obscurity. So there's different places. I mean, I also heavily lean on the work of other scholars. So if you're a scholar and you write a book about a woman in history and you quote from her speeches and you've gone through the archives, then I'm on it and I'm going to look for those speeches and write to the collections. Often they're in universities, they're in nonprofits, they have archives, and I write to the archivists and ask for permission to publish those speeches. Some big examples here in the United States are NYU has a huge archive. Smith College in Northampton has a huge archive of women's speeches. The Schlesinger Library at Harvard, huge, vast archives of women's speeches. And I'm sure there are many in Europe that I just have no clue about. There's a wonderful site in France called Gallica. And Gallica has speeches by women, many speeches by women from different periods in French history, going back to the French Revolution. There were a lot of women who spoke up in public during the French Revolution, through the Commune 150 years ago, the Paris Commune. So Gallica is a great resource.
Mm. And do you find that we were talking a minute ago about the sorts of things that women are speaking about? Do you find that there is a different way of speaking? That they've got a different, because we often hear about women being more nurturing, being more community minded, men being more about status. As you're reading these speeches, do you get that feeling, or is there a sort of a woman's type of speech, or is that something that's a bit of a construct?
My view is that because of women's historic role in the family and in the social sphere, that women were more focused on those issues. Yes, that's undeniable. Women would speak about family, they would speak about children, they would speak about marriage, they would speak about social concerns, welfare concerns, education, communal concerns. But in terms of the way they communicated, the language that they used, the vocabulary, the style of presentation, I do not detect a difference. I think women are as powerful as orators and as lacking in power as men are. The gamut is the same for men and women. So if someone says, well, yeah, you've collected all those speeches by women, but were they any good? Someone might, if not say that, they might think it. And in fact, yes, they are that good. They are that good. And if you look at some of the anthologies that I've looked at over the years, a lot of the men's speeches weren't that good. There is a place on the homepage of my website, speakingwhilefemale.co, that's where the archive is. There's a link to an infographic that I created with the 230 speech anthologies that I looked at in the English language, 230 of them. That's how many that I tracked down, and I counted all the speeches by men and women. And I can tell you there are a lot of boring, dry, dull speeches by men in those collections.
And so in those collections, how many of them what are the proportion of women's speeches and men's speeches?
Well, I put them all in this infographic, and you can glance at it, and you can see at a glance, the green represents the proportion of women's speeches, and the black or dark blue represents men's speeches. And at a glance, you can see that the vast majority of these anthologies had either only speeches by men, no speeches by women, or they had just a few speeches by women. I have books here, speech anthologies, in which they have sections for women. They'll say on women's rights or about women's concerns, and there are no speeches by women. They're all
my
women.
Goodness. Oh my goodness.
That's the equivalent of the mantle. That's the exact corollary to the men-only panel. They just didn't care what women had to say. That's the bottom line. I mean, you could say, I've thought about this in a lot of different ways. You could say they were silenced, women. You could say that they were suppressed. Their voices were suppressed. You could say they were not allowed to speak. You could say they weren't educated. You could say a lot of bottom line is men did not care what women had to say. They just didn't credit what women had to say. So women could be speaking about all these issues, affairs of state, affairs of great gravity, and men were not interested.
Which is we all know, but it doesn't mean that it's any less shocking.
It's just a new level of shock, or a new
level of shock.
It's a new form of shock.
Yeah.
One of the people who has spoken and written so eloquently about this is Mary Beard. Mary Beard is a classicist, an expert in ancient Rome and also ancient Greece, and she's very well known in Britain, but also around the world for her books, her many books, her scholarship, and also the BBC series that she's done about the ancient world. But she also gave a couple of talks for the London Review of Books, 2 different talks she gave in which she addressed this lopsided accounting of women's voice in history. And she traces this back to the first Western work of literature in which a woman was told to shut up. And she talks about Odysseus, the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. So Homer goes on this multi-year trip around the Mediterranean. He goes to war and battle, and he travels, and he comes home after a few years. And his son Telemachus is there, and all the men have gathered around. And Penelope comes into the room. She's been weaving. Penelope's been weaving. And Telemachus, her son, says, "Go back to your room and go back to women's affairs." So Mary Beard calls this the first historical example of a man telling a woman, "Oh, do shut up, dear."
Yeah.
"Oh, do shut up, dear." It sounds better if you have a British accent, but you get it.
I got it. And of all those speeches, do you have any particular favorites or any that really stand out?
Well, my favorite is always the one I just found. It's always the one I just added, and I'm constantly adding them. Just last night, I was looking at this section that I have. I made a section for sports and athletics, and it is really challenging for me to find historic speeches by women on sports and athletics. In fact, it's so hard, I might end up just taking away that category altogether, because I don't want to just have videos from YouTube. I mean, there's a lot of really amazing women athletes now, but I don't want to have YouTube videos. I want to find ancient, older speeches. So I did manage to dig up a few short words that Babe Dietrichson Zaharias made. She was, of course, a great athlete and a golf pro. And when she won the U.S. Women's Open in 1954, I believe, just before she died a couple of years later of colon cancer, but she made remarks, and I found them and put them in there. But also, the other thing I found last night, which was a real revelation, was relating to this whole issue of brain injuries that athletes who engage in contact sports incur, repetitive brain injuries. Of course, this has had a big impact in recent years on football and rugby and soccer and all kinds of sports where in which the participants sometimes die at an early age, and their brains are found to have brain injuries that cause early Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's-like symptoms. So the scholar who did all this research was Anne McKee. She was a neuroscientist, an American scholar, Anne McKee. And I just found her 2006 testimony. She's testified before Congress numerous times on this subject, but way back in 2006, before really mainstream media had caught on to it, she was in Congress talking about it in the context of mixed martial arts and what she had found by studying the brains of athletes. And I thought, that really deserves merit. She put her expertise into the world, and really she has changed the face of sports and athletics and really brought a whole new era where we are protecting or trying to protect the heads and skulls and brains of athletes who participate in these sports. So that's a new example, but I'm very proud of finding that.
And so a woman who's actually making a difference and being listened to.
Right. And it was that, this issue only came to the forefront, I think, in the last 10 years or so, even less than that. But she was back in 2006, she was testifying to Congress and trying to make a difference.
And do you find that things that women are being listened to more as the years go on?
Oh, yes, of course. Of course. It's changing tremendously, enormously. Here in the States, we just had our Vice President Kamala Harris giving a commencement speech at the U.S. Naval Academy for the first time. It's the first time a woman gave a commencement address at the U.S. Naval Academy. Well, that's something to celebrate. Something to celebrate. And I'm saying that whether you support Kamala Harris or not, whether you think she's doing a good job or not, it's historic that women are accorded that responsibility and also that honor to appear at a service academy and deliver those remarks. So yes, absolutely. Now, if you turn on the news, we have women experts being interviewed, adding their expertise, their ideas. We have women newscasters. Yeah, the situation has changed. Is it the way it needs to be? No, there's still a lot of work to do. And the progress that we've seen in the developed world certainly is not replicated in many other parts of the world that are a few steps behind us in terms of, in terms of development. But I think in our children and our children's lifetime, it will be a completely different story. We will see women's voices and expertise accorded the respect that they deserve.
Have there been particular inflection points where, in history, as you look at these speeches, have there been particular times when things have changed dramatically? So suddenly you find that women are being silenced more, or suddenly you find that women are being listened to more. And I'm thinking of that also in terms of the fact that now women are being listened to much more. Is there an inflection point for that?
Well, I'll just toss out a few to think about in terms of historic inflection points. One, of course, is I mentioned two of them. One was the suffrage period, and specifically the late 19th century, as really these organizations the movements gathered steam. I mean, I just read the other day that in London, during the towards the end of the suffrage period, which was like 19 teens or so, there were hundreds of rallies for suffrage every week in London. Every week. If you can imagine how many women that would have been speaking at those rallies, it's in the tens of thousands. So suffrage, yes, for sure. And then around World War I, the peace movement, the international peace movement was huge. Women from all over the world were speaking out because they had seen what happened in World War I and they didn't want it to happen again. And of course, history unfolded the way it did. We had the First World War and the Second World War. And I think we've woken up to the fact that the peace movement, so to speak, has not been as powerful. So as they would have hoped. So the peace movement is not as strong as it used to be. But around the peace movement, or World War I was a big turning point. I would say around women's reproductive rights. Women began to use their voices all over the world, asking for contraception.
In the 1960s?
It was really before that. I mean, the Margaret Sanger and other women demanding contraceptions were really in the 19-teens, 1920s. It was also in France, in Latin America, in Argentina. Women were demanding this. Women were demanding the right to use contraceptions because it was illegal. In the United States, it was illegal to send any information about contraception through the mail.
My goodness.
Because of laws that were passed in the 1870s and were still on the books. And then, of course, I mean, an obvious modern example is the Me Too movement, which started in the United States but became global. And now it's unfolding with great force in France, of course. There's been in the last year, according to what I've been reading, there's been an outpouring of women's voices around this subject. So these issues do come in ebbs and flows, but that was a big catalyst for women speaking out and raising their voices.
Mm. And are there particular speeches that you're looking for at the moment? Are there directions that you're looking at the moment?
Well, I'm very conscious that I have an American perspective, and I'm limited by that. So I really am looking for people in other countries who can help me expand this resource. I mean, my vision is that this website will be housed somewhere. Some institution will have it, because I won't be here forever, and that it will be a resource so that students, scholars, and especially little girls, young women, can click on it and see themselves, people who look like them, people from their own country. I think of it from Kansas to Kuala Lumpur. I want young girls and women all over the world to be able to see what a powerful woman looks like and sounds like, read her words and be inspired. So I am looking for people who can help me find speeches from other parts of the world, other voices.
And you mentioned as we were chatting before we got on the online that you had a particular interest in Australia and New Zealand at the moment.
Well, it just inspires me that there were women in New Zealand, especially Kate Shepherd, who was a very active suffragist in New Zealand, who got the vote for women passed. I think it was 1893. And that was, I believe that's the right date. Maybe I'm off a little bit, but that was a big sign of hope and a catalyst for women in other countries, especially women in the United States. They saw what was coming. They saw that it happened there and it was going to happen elsewhere. So I admire Kate Shepherd and all those women suffragists in New Zealand, but also there were women in the Maori community who were speaking up for Maori women's rights in New Zealand, and Aboriginal women in Australia. So I have a section called Indigenous Lives. It's devoted to Indigenous women all over the world. And it is inspiring and remarkable to see the range of Indigenous women's voices that have contributed to our shaping our ideas as they've evolved through the centuries. So I'm really trying to be as inclusive and diverse as possible.
And with the women that you're working with, as coaching them in their speaking, what sort of challenges are they facing? What are the things that they find difficult? What do they need help working on?
Well, I would say that women don't face different challenges from men in terms of skill set, in terms of knowing how to shape your ideas and messages so that they're succinct and powerful is not a gendered thing. Knowing how to speak powerfully in front of an audience, to how to hold yourself on stage, how to use your arms, how to speak in a voice that's resonant and can be heard, how to make eye contact with audience members, all those things, men need them just as women do. Men and women equally. And I like to work with men and women equally. All the training that I do for public speaking applies to men just as well as women. However, women need it more. Why do women need it more? I always say more women need it than most men. Some men have a lot of problems with it, but more women have more problems because they don't do it as much. That's the simple reason. There's nothing genetic about it. There's nothing biological about it. It's simply down to the fact that the more you do it, the better you get. And when women don't do it as often, they're not comfortable. They don't like it. It's a vicious circle. They don't like it, so they don't do it. So they're not as good at it. And it goes, these things go all the way back, I'm convinced, to childhood, to youth education. I'm a judge, and I coach debate here, high school debate, forensics here in the area where I live. And I can tell you that young girls and boys start out in debate around the same numbers in the school system, but the girls and young women drop out. They drop out before the guys do. Why do they drop out? Well, there have been PhDs written about this, so I can't pretend to be an expert, but I do know, I have written about it and read about it, that women drop out around the age when they get to puberty, when they become more conscious of social dynamics, and they think it's not okay to be aggressive in a debate. And also the corollary to that is women deal with failure. Sometimes some girls deal with failure poorly. They're not as involved in athletics. They don't learn that in order to win, you have to fail a lot. And as soon as they get into the varsity levels, the higher reaches, and they start to fail, because in debate, you can't win every debate. It's impossible. It's impossible. You win some, you lose some, just like in sports, but they have a harder time dealing with the failure. So it's a combination of sociological issues and practice. If we get more women to do it, more young girls to do it, more young girls comfortable with the competitive element, comfortable with failing and winning and failing and winning and getting up and over time strengthening their skills, we will see big changes. And I'm convinced those changes are going to happen. It just takes effort. Effort on the part of institutions, educational institutions, forensic debate organizations, to give young girls and young women extra support. They need extra support so they can overcome some of the sociologically or societally incurred hesitations or reluctances or inhibitions.
I certainly see that with my clients, that first of all, the failure thing is that's really big. And for me, it's the flip side of this perfectionism, that it has to be perfect. If it's not perfect, then it's just not okay. And not knowing how to deal with failure.
Right. And that's not gendered. Men suffer from it like women do, but more women suffer. More women suffer than most men. Yeah. Right now, I'm coaching or working with a woman. She's in her 30s, who is in the police department here in New York City, and she has to make presentations. She's been elevated to a new position, has to make presentations, finds it incredibly hard. But she is brilliant. She's very insightful and very smart. Has very smart insight. She knows her material cold, but when she gets up to speak, she has a very hard time. And my suggestion to her is to do it more. In fact, I've said to her, you are lucky that you are being forced to do this in your job, because you're going to overcome this. You're going to overcome your stage fright, your fear, your sense of intimidation, your sense of that you're not worthy, the sense that you're going to fall apart. You're just going to overcome it with practice. And you're going to get better. Everybody does. Everybody does. With practice, everybody becomes a better speaker. Not everybody becomes the best speaker in the world. We can't be. There's always going to be people who are better than others, but everybody becomes more competent.
The other work that I do is just work around fear. What can you do with fear? And how can you deal with your fear in ways that are creative and getting you out of that fear space? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think about that a lot. And from my experience, I don't think there's one solution for everybody. People are so different. There's a number of I try to offer my clients a number of different possible solutions. And I say, try these on. Just try this one on. You know what I just did recently? I went to a doctor and got a handful. I think it gave me 6 or 8 beta blockers. Mm. It's a medication that slows down your heart rate a little. And they're given freely by doctors. They're not considered dangerous unless you have some underlying heart issue. So you have to get it from a medical doctor. You have to get a prescription. The doctor makes sure that your heart's okay. But I haven't tried them yet. But I have clients who use them all the time. If they have an interview coming up, an important job interview, if they have to go on stage, they pop this pill half an hour before, and it slows down their heart rate so they don't have the heartbeat. Now, I'm not pushing pills on anybody. I'm just telling you that is one option that you might consider. I mean, there's a lot of different tricks that you can explore. One of them that I've used with a lot of success for myself, because I too suffer from a lot of anxiety when I get on stage, less than I used to, much less. But I have a mental trick that I use. I got it from someone else. Somebody told me and I tried it and it works. I say, when I start to get nervous, I say, oh, welcome. There's my friend. There's my friend, fear. I know you're going to be here. Welcome. You go sit over there. And I mentally say, that's your seat. You're going to be here the whole time. I know you're there, but that's your seat. You stay there. Then I just say, okay, I accept it. My heart is racing. Maybe I'm getting a little sweaty. I'm getting anxious, but fear is sitting there and I'm here and I'm going on.
And so it's something that's separate from you. It isn't you. It's separate from you.
Yeah, that's right. I guess I haven't really analyzed it fully. I mean, I guess it's doing a lot of things. One is it's controlling it. It's separate. It's creating a distinction. It's controlling it. It's also normalizing it. It's saying, okay, I know you're going to be here. Just come on in. It's not pushing it away. It's not denying it. I think it operates in a profound way on our psyches. But that's very useful for me. That one, and then there's a lot of different tactics. Some people try breathing tactics. That doesn't work really well for me, but some people find a lot of balance and calm in their breathing techniques. Some people try feeling your feet on the ground. Just be aware of your feet on the ground, and that will give you more stability. So different strokes for different folks, but it is a real problem.
Absolutely.
A real problem that we have to address if we're going to be comfortable in that environment.
Well, Dana, just before, there's two questions I want to ask you to finish up. Before we do, I'd like to say that I think what you're doing is incredibly important. I think it's just fantastic that you're spending the time, that you're obviously you're looking for speeches from around the world in different languages. You're obviously incredibly enthusiastic about the project too, which is fantastic. So the last two things I want to ask you is, the first is, in your career, has it made a difference to you, either positive or negative, being a woman?
Well, it has, of course, because I am who I am. It's my identity. And I do think, I started out in journalism. I was in journalism for a long time. And journalism is a rough and tumble world. It used to be a very rough and tumble world. Especially news desks where, news is breaking all the time. When I started out, there were editors hollering, cursing at us all the time. There was no editing of the language that they used. I think it was harder for women. Women can be very tough. Some women can be tough as nails, but it was a challenge for me. And there were times that I really didn't take to that environment. And I think it's because I'm a woman. Now, I'm older now, I'm more secure, I'm tougher, and the work world has changed. Certainly the journalism world has changed. Bullying is not okay anymore. Men are losing their jobs all the time now for so-called bullying. That never happened when I was a young woman in the workplace. So yeah, I suffered from it. I struggled through it, and it did impact me and affect me in a whole range of ways. That's the best example I can think of.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing is, if you had a message for people who are listening, if there's any way that they can help, if there's anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to cover, just anything at all that you'd like to say to finish up.
Please, please, please get in touch with me if you can help me find some speeches. That's number one. And then number two is please share the archive with teachers that with instructors, with people who have influence over education, because I want this to be an educational tool. We talked about the importance of starting young with attitudes, changing the attitudes of young girls and young women. So I really want this to be used in the curricula, in history books, in this public speaking books, in debate formats. I want the example of powerful women speakers to be part of what students learn when they start navigating the world of ideas and thinking about putting their ideas into sharing their ideas and being influential. I want them to be able to look and see that anything is possible.
I think that's a fabulous place. It's a fabulous message, and it's a fabulous place for us to wind this up. So thank you so much for your time, Dana, and thank you for all that you're doing. I think it's just fantastic.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. It was really a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen, and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.